Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. When I'm reading an author bio and it says, at the end it always says he lives in blank. If it says he lives in San Francisco, I know something about him. He lives in Los Angeles or Sacramento, Fresno, on and on. I know something about that person. But if it says he lives in California, I can't figure out anything about the author from that. Does he lives in California tell you anything?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I might actually think that yes, it does tell you something. I think that the differences between us are somewhat exaggerated, though I know that they're very important for people. So that when I moved down to Los Angeles 2 years ago, and when I go back up to San Francisco, which I do frequently, and people ask me, well, how do you like it? And I say, I love it. And they say, really? And that there are certain attitudes, and there really are differences for sure. Although I think they seem to be kind of diminishing or accommodating each other, but that might be just because when people say when I moved down here and said I know people often say we live in two states. I don't think so. I think California is one state, and then people say no, it's not. It's 7 states or whatever. So I appreciate, I really appreciate those differences, and I do think that there's, there is something, of course, really distinct about Los Angeles. That there's kind of many things that are distinct about Los Angeles. Do you live on the west side or do you live on the east side? As there are, as there is with San Francisco. But, and I think it's hard, I think if the bio says he lives in California, I think I have some feeling for that. I'm not certain that I can tell you exactly what that means, though, because it can mean so many different things. It is distinct from New York, of course, and it's even distinct from Nevada, where I lived for 12 years. But it is so many things. I'm not sure I can tell you what it is, but there is certainly something California, and in Boom we see ourselves, as a journal of California in the world and the world in California, and so I think there's something distinct and important and cool about that, but it is multifaceted.
Where perhaps we can settle everything in this hour. Yeah. This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down at UCLA in California, in Los Angeles, speaking with Jon Christensen. He is the editor of the newly and excitingly just last year relaunched and relocated Boom, a journal of California. People outside of California, and the farther you go, at least in America, the more this seems to hold true. If they know an important, quote-unquote, important distinction about California, it's Northern California versus Southern California, the old NorCal and SoCal stickers on trucks and whatnot. But it's one of these things, whenever it comes up, I feel like I tell anybody who will listen, that divide seems almost meaningless to me. Like, there's not a lot of difference, especially between the major cities of Northern and Southern California, because when people talk about that, they're talking about the west side of California. They're talking about coastal California. If you look at the divide east-west in California, it's so stark, you might as well be in 2 different countries. I mean, how does it feel to you? Is the north-south divide actually meaningful to you? Is it bleached out by east-west like it is for me, or where do you fall on that?
Well, again, I think there is really something to that. I'm always reminded of the band Pavement's song "Two States." We're two states, and they were from Stockton, right? Which is kind of Northern California, but it's also Central Valley. It's that it's that eastern part of California, and and there are very distinct differences between coastal California and inland California in terms of certainly, the geography of the Central Valley, that great vast flat plain with the Sierra rising, to the east, and the Coast Range separating it from the coast, which is much more influenced by the ocean and ocean breezes, and cool and wet. And Northern California, hot and dry in the Central Valley. We here in Southern California, certainly have the kind of temperate influence of the coast and the ocean here, but as soon as you go across the mountains, you're in the desert, and right. It really you're in the real desert. Yes.
It doesn't stop people from thinking Los Angeles or just asserting Los Angeles is a desert. I always wonder why do people just say that? It's clearly not true.
Well, that's right. There's a real history to that, and we had an essay that explored that in a special issue that we did last fall on the Los Angeles aqueduct. And so there's a real historical rhetoric that developed around Los Angeles as a desert that was also connected to the critique of its so-called water grab, the taking water from the Owens Valley. So if you had to bring water from so far away to provide, for life, for people, for plants, for trees, for industry here in Los Angeles, and in many ways, maybe it is a desert if it needs that water. But also there was, immediately the trope that developed, that Mike Davis calls the literary destruction of Los Angeles, of imagining what would happen if all of that failed, right. That we would return to the desert.
Well, we have new technology now. There's other ways to get water now, are they not? This is something I learned a little bit about by reading Boom, is we're entering new things are possible with water now, and it's not something people think about, is it? But first of all, people don't think much about water, do they? Really?
Well, I think, water is one of these things that you don't think about until you don't have it.
Right. As like air, you're just breathing.
Yeah, as long as you turn on the tap and clean water comes out, clean drinkable water, which of course not all people on Earth have, but we, in general that we tend to have that. It's certainly one of the great accomplishments of 19th and 20th and 21st century cities is to provide that so that you don't have to think about it. So there are there are a lot of new possibilities around water as well.
What is actually the problem? I feel like everybody kind of knows that Southern California, and more so Los Angeles, has some problem related to water, but I think that's where a lot of the knowledge stops. What is the problem with water here? What's the matter with water in Los Angeles?
Well, in fact, I think probably what's the matter with water in Los Angeles is that in many ways, people don't understand it. And I think right now we think that there's more of a problem than there really is. And that and also the idea that what's the matter with water in Los Angeles is Los Angeles. So if you just stop there and you think, the problem is Los Angeles, that's not going to get you very far, because what in many ways, that's also the kind of myth that really makes it difficult to talk about water in California, is that people think that the problem with water in California is Los Angeles or Southern California,
and all you guys down there hogging the water,
and in many ways. at this point, Los Angeles and Southern California more generally are really among the most kind of progressive and together areas, metropolitan regions in the state around water, because it's been several decades of really concerted efforts at conservation, so that while population has gone up, consumption of water has not. So per capita consumption has gone down, as well as a diversification of sources. Now, of course, one of the other problems with water in Los Angeles is that we're dependent on sources from far away. We're first, Los Angeles, dependent on the Owens Valley through the LA Aqueduct from water from 200 miles away in the eastern Sierra. We're dependent then next on the Colorado River for the greater Southern California area and region, and then also from the State Water Project for the water that comes from the delta of the Sacramento and San Joaquin. So, we're very much dependent on a much larger region. And many people think that's a problem.
What's wrong with getting your water? What's wrong with getting water from an area with not much population to one with people who need it?
Well, so that is the big question, right? And so I guess the first, you might ask, what right do we have to take that water from?
You can go back to the founding of America. You can ask what rights a lot of people have to do a lot of things.
And I mean, in the history of the American West is built on appropriating water from places and using it in other places, and that whole doctrine of appropriation that is the basis of Western water law is based on that principle. So you're absolutely right. There's really nothing new about it. I think what has come to concern people then is not just what happens to the people in, say, the Owens Valley, but what happens to those ecosystems, to species, to the future of that of that place. And I think that has been, a really important part of the conversation over the last, 20, 30 years is what is our responsibility to that place that we get water from. And I think that's actually a really interesting and important question all over the American West. And I feel like there's a turning point. We're going through a change here in Los Angeles where, although it's hard to kind of put kind of neat boundaries around it, it feels like we're beginning to take more responsibility, to be more aware. Although you're right. I mean, most people are not aware from where their water comes from. But I do think there is.
The day it doesn't run when they turn it on, though, people are going to get concerned.
Yeah, and I think there's more awareness that we have a responsibility to the Owens Valley. We have a responsibility for the delta of the Sacramento and the San Joaquin, which is another reason why I think it's important for us to realize that we live in one state.
Right. Well, it can be so remote. I mean, I go to Sacramento every so often because my mom lives near there, but at the same time, there's a lot of Angelinos, a lot of San Franciscans who will never go to Sacramento, let alone, out to a far-flung place like the Owens Valley, right? There's really no solving that except by a publication like Boom. It seems like, because you can't really force people to go to places some people legitimately have no reason to go to the rest of California, right? But you can open their minds in other ways. Is that a good way to put sort of one of the premises of Boom?
How we talk about it is that and talk about with our writers and our contributors and our editors is that we want to host once a quarter one of the liveliest, most interesting, fun dinner party conversations in California. And it's as if you're inviting, say, a dozen of your friends over to your house, and they're from all walks of life. There's some folks who are in the university, the nonprofits, your high school friend, a friend from down the street, an artist, a writer, a photographer, and journalists. You're all having the same passionate conversation about the things that you care about. That's the voice that we're looking for, and we really do strive to bring those diverse voices from all over California, which can be a challenge because California is so diverse, geographically, demographically, and so we do want to represent and have a place for those voices in those places, that art, that writing from all over California. But we also see, in a sense, that California is not just about California. California means something to the whole world, and that's something that we're really interested in. Is what is California's conversation with the rest of the world? Why, if you go around the world and people ask where you're from and you say California, their eyes light up. Yes. And then we also see, of course, that the world is in California, right? I mean, particularly, I think, particularly if you walk around, or take the bus or the metro or, drive around Los Angeles, you see the world in Los Angeles. But that's really true all over California.
It's true. It's more sort of intensified in Los Angeles. You see, as you say on the bus, I rode the bus here from Koreatown, where I live, to UCLA, and it's the people inside the bus that change as you go, but the outside as well. It's like you really are. I mean, it's more so if you go down, say, Pico Boulevard, but there's a lot of streets you can go down where it's you get really that impact in Los Angeles of crossing culture to culture to culture, where you kind of do in San Francisco, but you also feel like you're in the culture of San Francisco. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, San Francisco is a peculiar city, and I think getting more and more peculiar in some ways that I've lived in San Francisco in the Bay Area for 20 years of my life at various times, and I love it and go back there frequently. And
it seems impossible to dislike. Like first things first.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, it's one of I think it's one of the world's favorite cities, right? So we are doing an issue right now that is coming out this summer on what's the matter with San Francisco.
Oh boy, that's going to be a 900-page issue. The first nearly 1,000-page boom.
It could be, but it's. I think you're right in the sense that there is that diversity in San Francisco, but also San Francisco is 7 miles by 7 miles. It's 49 square miles.
Not even close to 1 million people in it.
Yeah, but I think what is it, around 800,000 something
on a good
now? And it's a kind of jewel box of a city. It's and it has this preciousness, which is really wonderful, but it can also, I think, be limiting, particularly if what happens is it so often does, and I think as the debate that's happening in San Francisco right now is, when it just focuses on San Francisco and it doesn't focus on the whole Bay Area and the metropolitan region and its relationship to the world. It's missing, it's missing so much. I think about often what Raymond Williams, the great cultural, literary, critic and theorist, said, at the end of his great book on the country and the city, that it's not about those two things in isolation from each other anymore. It's about the relationships.
It's something I think about a lot because San Francisco is a major city. It's arguably better known by the world than Los Angeles is, or more intimately known by the world than Los Angeles is. It's also a lot smaller, of course, so it's more easily known. But you talk about going back to Northern California to visit and friends saying, how do you like it in Los Angeles? And sort of giving you that askew look when you say you do like it here. And people from outside Los Angeles often assume, as you well know, there must be a rivalry. San Francisco versus Los Angeles, you must be at each other's throats. But they don't realize that it's one way. It's San Francisco with a sort of unilateral rivalry against Los Angeles. I think everybody I know here likes San Francisco and goes fairly often. But there's also that thing, I moved to Los Angeles myself for no good reason, really, other than being fascinated by it. But I could have moved anywhere. I could have been San Francisco. But I thought to myself, in San Francisco, if you say you're in San Francisco, and there's a sense that your first priority was living in San Francisco. Whatever you're doing there is priority number 2. It's not for every industry there, not for every type of life, but it feels like San Francisco is such a goal in itself that other parts of my life would be subordinated to being in San Francisco. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, but I think you're right. I mean, that being in San Francisco is an end in itself.
Right. There's that. And I feel like if there's a sense that everybody likes San Francisco better. Everybody quote unquote everybody, but also implicitly, yeah. But if you were really going to work hard on your thing in life, you'd be in Los Angeles. If that was the choice, you know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I think so I think we're kind of getting deep into some stereotypes.
Well, this is what I sense from when people talk.
That people have about each city. The geographer Richard Walker has a great book that's riffing on Raymond Williams' title that is The Country and the City, and it's about how the San Francisco and the Bay Area have been such an amazing place of conservation over the last century and a half, and he traces it for a variety of reasons that have evolved over time. But his argument really is that it has been people and environmental movements and conservation efforts that have constructed this landscape that is both human and natural, right? And you get the feeling. I think there's this wonderful feeling of this was made by people, which is great. And it's really one of the great cities of the world. And justifiably, I think people can feel it's actually the best place on earth to live. I mean, the most beautiful metropolitan region in a natural setting that was made by this effort of people, and that people, justly feel, great about that. My sense after, being there for a very long time is I would often, talk to people, involved in parks and conservation efforts and say, like, I get it, I mean, this is really the best possible place on earth. And sure, there are still more things to worry about and fight over and conserve and preserve, and you should. But I think it's also that lift up your heads, look around the rest of the state, look around the rest of the world, and the conversation to be in about cities in California, about cities in the world, really, that I think that the experience and the amazing experience and passion and intelligence of people in the San Francisco Bay Area around these issues of urbanism and nature could really contribute in very interesting ways. But there is often a kind of insularity that comes, I think, from being in the most beautiful city in the world. And I mean, here in LA, we don't have that sense, it's when I first came here, I would, quite literally for the first 6 months or so, every day, I wanted to pinch myself. And part of it, half the time it was because it really is beautiful. The air, the light, sometimes the views of the mountains or the ocean or, down these avenues to, different places, the diversity of the city. But other times it was just like, it's so weird. But I do sense that I sense, I'm curious what you think. I mean, there's a kind of insecurity in LA that I think, it is really useful and productive. I mean, we know that there's still work to be done. It's messed up, it's messy, it's complicated. Yeah. That makes it interesting.
It does. There's that. There's also the sort of compared to what question, It's almost what's the word I'm looking for? Like in an equation when something is given. Axiomatic. It's almost axiomatic that Los Angeles is badly broken, like terribly broken, on the verge of unsalvageable, but probably salvageable, but it will always be moving toward a state of unbrokenness that it will never reach. But I wonder, I mean, sometimes on some days I'm like, what specifically is the brokenness? I know we've all agreed, even people who love Los Angeles have agreed it has major problems, but on some days those problems are elusive and they're difficult to really pin down, aren't they? Or do you have a good sense of X, Y, and Z? This is what's wrong with Los Angeles. I mean, does it seem clear cut to you, or does it seem it seems vague to me?
Well, so when my colleagues around UCLA, and particularly those working in environment and sustainability, talk about what's wrong with Los Angeles and what we need to work on fixing, transportation, energy, water, other aspects of sustainability. Really think hard about solutions to some of these problems, like traffic and traffic jams and transportation times. I mean, the thing that I always try to say first is, like, hold on just for a minute. LA actually works for millions of people. And maybe we should start by recognizing why it works, why people are here, what they're doing, how it works for them.
They haven't stopped coming.
Before we try to fix it. I'm not saying that there aren't important things that we should all be thinking about fixing, adjusting, changing, but we might start from the position that let's understand how it works and why it works first. I mean, a response that that I've gotten is, well, it works for some people and it doesn't work for others, and that's very true.
What is
right?
What is the city that works for everybody? Where is the city? Like, maybe can I move there? Or?
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's called utopia.
Yes. You mentioned the transportation issues in Los Angeles, and it's a common topic on this show and in my life and the lives of many here, because when you ask somebody who says they hate Los Angeles, what do you hate? They usually first say, oh, it's all the driving. Or if they don't, increasingly many don't have cars here, but then they'll say, oh, it's the fact that the buses are slow when I can't, and the trains are sometimes non-existent, which is true, but I frame that more as it's better, it seems to be more profitably explained as maybe a problem of connection. The parts are not that well connected in Los Angeles sometimes in many respects, but then that's also kind of a problem of California. We mentioned earlier, there is sometimes just a psychological disconnect. One person in Los Angeles may know nothing about someone in Sacramento, or indeed most of the rest of the state, but literally, there's this whole high-speed rail thing people talk about in California, many with the assumption that this is never going to happen. They're going to screw this up, or it's not going to go right, and it's going to be really expensive. The assumption that it won't work. You wrote a bit in the New Yorker about the much-discussed concept of the Hyperloop, framing it as maybe this is just a piece of vaporware put out there to criticize this whole idea that high-speed rail is never going to make it in California. I wonder, why a state as robust as California, in a country like America, why do we assume that something like a high-speed rail connection and connecting like 5 cities together will never happen?
Well, I think we've found it harder and harder to believe that the government can solve big problems, and so there's a history to this, and Michael Hiltzik, the business columnist for the LA Times, wrote a piece for us in our issue on the LA aqueduct, and what came out of that piece for me was why is it so difficult for us to sell the future to Californians? And I think you're right. It's probably not just Californians. It's Americans. It may be even more broad than that. Though I think it's a particularly kind of American disillusionment. That has a very particular history in the aftermath and criticism of Great Society programs, the Vietnam War, the disillusionment with that, kind of sunny but somewhat empty optimism that came, with Reagan, and this kind of, is it neoconservative, neoliberal, somewhat libertarian, but skeptical of big government in any case, era that we've been, I think, living through in the last 20 years or so. I don't think we have a really good understanding of what it is that government does and can do, and what and is actually doing. We've made what government does invisible, just like where we get our water from is invisible. We don't notice it until it's gone, and then we're really shocked and like, how could they have screwed up so badly? So
who do I blame?
Yeah, so I think after looking at the history of the LA Aqueduct, I think that we don't have figures like William Mulholland who can go out and sell this vision of the future, almost single-handedly and persuade the voters to vote on bonds, that will fund the building of the aqueduct, or a Pat Brown who said, the state water project was going to be a monument to himself. I think Jerry Brown I think high-speed rail may be that for Jerry Brown, which, maybe is a good thing, that he's taking it so personally, right, that he's going to fight for it, and he's going to figure out a way to do it. Right. And maybe that's actually what it takes, although, I think we're also in a much more diverse, pluralistic, era in which projects like that, can't just be sold as this one big project. They also have to be sold in every single community.
And it has to go to Merced first.
It has to go to Merced first. If there's a water bond, there has to be something in it for different constituencies, different voters, that are, clean water or parks or, other things like that.
I do a lot of world travel for this show, and certain countries that I go to, whether usually they're in Asia, but in Europe as well, I have these moments where I'm like, why can't we have this back in Los Angeles? Usually it's to do with trains or something like that. It's about transit or some other type of service. And I'm going to Korea next week to record 45 interviews for the show. And I know when I get there, I'm going to be riding the KTX, that high-speed train from Seoul to Busan, which is about the distance, San Francisco to Los Angeles. It'll take 2 hours. And I'll be like, why couldn't we do this in America? Korea was in shambles 60 years ago, like literally in ruins. Somehow now they have all this, and it'll take me back to so what's wrong with America? What's wrong with California? Why don't we have this? Then I think, Korean history, they had a dictator for a long time who could just command a train be put in, an expressway be put in, and who, if he wanted to, could kill thousands of people on a whim. So there's a sense in which I always come back to, well, is having a train that goes fast really tied in with having to accept authoritarianism? Is it really in California? Is this just the other side of the yin yang with the kind of democracy we have? Everybody has a say. No authoritarians are killing thousands. Is it just the price to pay that we have to wait generations for a train that gets you to San Francisco in under 8 hours?
Well, I think, look back at the post-World War II era. We live in a different America now, but I do think that there are things that we can look back and say, this was a time of very different policies, where there was, major government investment in infrastructure, in the interstate highway system, in education, in the University of California, and so on and so forth. And it was also a period of great economic mobility, of less inequity, more equality, more opportunity. And that's a combination of historical factors, economic factors, but it's also political choices, and it's how we view the role of the government in providing for the public good, and not just alone, but in combination with business, in combination with nonprofits, in combination with educational institutions. My sense is, and this is a little bit like reading the tea leaves, that we're going to see changes, and that California is a place, once again, where we can see some of those changes early on. That California becoming predominantly that oxymoron of minority majority, increasingly Latino state, young, so young, diverse. The millennial generation is, going to decide the next 3 or 4 presidential elections, is going to, if they get out and vote,
big if.
It is, but I think as they get older, they're going to be more likely to vote. That will bring, and I think is bringing, changes in how we see the role of government, and that I think we're always going to have that tension in America. I think, but it goes back and forth, and I think we may see a movement, back toward understanding the important role and active role that government can play in helping to structure the kind of society and communities, economy that we want. There is a good role there.
As I sometimes think about, maybe if California were its own country, some of this would get ironed out. A lot of it seems to be, there's a lot of state-federal conflict in every state of the union, but it does seem like California is not unique, but it's certainly on one end of the spectrum as far as not quite seeing eye to eye with the country as a whole. Does it seem that way to you?
Well, there's those great old historical maps of California as an island, and in many ways California, is still is figuratively an island, is different and separate, and in some ways, almost quite literally. I mean, being separated by the Sierra and the Siskiyou Mountains to the north. Although our kind of continuity with Baja California, it's tempting to think of sort of Baja Alta California as being one continuous, thing. So it does, break down a bit. There's also, of course, those, sometimes you see these maps during elections, where, California is a blue state surrounded by red states, or, things like this. So I think it is, it's certainly, it's possible and can be very productive to think of California as a state apart, and even in a way as its own country. Although, of course, we're not.
True, and won't become. There's not really a very respectable secession movement going on anywhere in California. I mean, I guess there is the whole state of Jefferson thing, but that's making a new state. That's not making a new country. We'll get back to the state of Jefferson, I'm sure, but I want to ask, when you decided to make the move to work here at Boom, coming not quite from so far north as the proposed state of Jefferson, from the Bay Area, what did you do to psychologically prepare yourself, reading, watching, what have you, to make that jump from north to south?
I just jumped in wholeheartedly.
So it's go first, then figure it out.
Yes, exactly. You know, I grew up never living anywhere for more than a few years. I was born in Minnesota and lived, as a child and, outside of Seattle, and then back to Minneapolis, and then to Cincinnati, and then Paris and Madrid and Chicago before coming out to California to go to college, and then living in Brazil for a year, and then Nevada. And so, I'm something of a nomad. Home is where I hang my hat, is the place where I am. Yes, and so, so it's, it is after for me, later in life, it's not quite been a 7-year itch, although I think the itch maybe begins around then. It's, but sort of 8, 9, 10 years. And I'm thinking, and I often thought, well, I should settle down, but and then I thought, why?
It's a big world.
There's more to, there's more to see and experience, and in some ways, it's in my blood, And so I was just super excited to come to LA and being confused and being a newcomer and being a beginner. Is something that I love.
It's something often said by people who love Los Angeles or hate Los Angeles, anything between. They all concede that, or they all say that Los Angeles is not like any other city in the world. Given your experience living in so many cities, is there truth to that? If something does separate Los Angeles from every other major city, what is it?
I've seen a lot of cities, but I feel like I should answer that question by, I haven't seen enough cities to know, to know whether that's true.
But does this feel like starkly different from the other places you've lived? Like, oh, this is a different game I'm playing here. This isn't like different rules. This is something different in kind, and not just in degree, not just in location or sensibility.
I'm not sure of that because, if I understand Ed Soja's, arguments, which I have thought about and struggled with a lot, and read his recent book on Los Angeles, that I think. My interpretation of it is that Los Angeles is like every other metropolitan region in the world, except more so, and that it is where urbanism, in a sense, metropolitanism is headed. That it's not about cities in the sense of city centers. And in that way, I mean, San Francisco is the anomaly, really. Los Angeles is more the example of where things are going, that it's about a metropolitan region, that you can't understand it without understanding the region, that you can't understand it without understanding global flows of capital and goods and people. And in that way, I mean, Los Angeles, it's so exciting to be here in Los Angeles because it does seem like the kind of ne plus ultra of global cities. And in that sense, I kind of think other cities are like Los Angeles, just not so much, so.
It's fascinating. I read a lot of books on Los Angeles. Try not to look surprised about that. But I'm sure you have as well. And the ones from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they're all very excited about the sheer size of Los Angeles. Like, wow, look at how big the city is. But then if you consider Orange County to be part of Los Angeles, and if you consider the whole valley to be, and everything between Santa Barbara and San Diego, look at the huge size of this place. They're just marveling over the size. And it's fascinating to me that how much they saw in that, how much possibilities for a new form of city they saw in just how big a region Los Angeles, whatever you consider that to be, covers. And reading those books, from the 60s, from earlier, I still get excited when I talk about the possibilities of that. But for a while there in real life, it seemed like the size of Los Angeles, the sort of city as region quality of Los Angeles, translated to a lot of mini malls that you drove to get different things. It seems like now that concept is finally coming to fruition, the way that you're seeing more concentrations of people and things and jobs in various centers all around that are getting more connected. And in a weird way, this dream of Los Angeles, this 20th century, mid-century dream, is now becoming something appealing in the way that it was talked about before. Do you understand what I mean, or am I reaching a bit too far?
No, I think that's I think that's exactly right, and I think it's why it's so exciting to be here in Los Angeles right now.
So long?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting. As you frame it that way, I think it puts a new light on it for me, and so that's really interesting. It's giving some more historical context to, I think, what Christopher Hawthorne at the Los Angeles Times has written a lot about, that we're living in this period of transition, and what Los Angeles is going to become is going to be defined by us. Is it going to be a more pedestrian and bike friendly and transit oriented city? It very likely could be, but it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of political effort and economic effort. You put an interesting twist on it by saying, and I think this is right, that that was a 20th century dream, and perhaps we'll be able to realize it in the 21st century. I'm going to venture a hypothesis here about why it didn't happen earlier, and go back to the insights of Ed Soja and others, that that period of deindustrialization in the late 20th century, and what he calls that reindustrialization, of a new economy, was very, very painful, and was very, very disruptive. And I think that really, threw a monkey wrench into that dream that was a very disruptive time. And I think we're still living in the aftermath of that, and there's lots of issues to be worked out about access to jobs, affordable housing, transportation, and the unequal distribution of those goods across the metropolitan landscape. But it does seem that we're beginning to figure out the new contours of that, and that there might be some very good things that can come of that.
Tell me what you did. What was your process to choose? This is the all-important question in Los Angeles, to choose where you would live when you knew you would come to Los Angeles.
So I took out a map of Los Angeles and drew concentric circles around UCLA, I think it was a mile, 3 miles, what I thought was 5 miles, but I think I got a little bit off. So I think that 5 mile ring actually ended up at 7 miles, and it was and looking south and towards and west towards the ocean, so not going back over the hills to the San Fernando Valley. And so we looked at a bunch of different places, within those circles, and my partner Ursula Heise, she was a little more freaked out by LA at first than I was, so we got shown around by, a realtor, and it really did seem like, you'd see a house, kind of, a cool house, and, then you'd go through this completely illegible landscape of, houses and low-rise apartment buildings and freeways and mini malls, and then you'd see another house, and you'd do the same thing, in one day, 6 or 7 different places. And on the second day, we just completely lucked out within that, outer concentric ring. We found a really lovely place in Venice, about a mile and a half from the beach. So just near the edge of Mar Vista, so that some of our friends would tease us and say, "Oh, that's not Venice, that's Mar Vista."
Very important boundary.
We got very familiar with the kind of neighborhoodness of
Mar Vista's good enough for Ed Soja. It's good enough for any of us.
Yeah, I know, and we're on the Mar Vista side of Lincoln Boulevard, so so we just completely lucked out and fell in love with the place, and that's how we ended up in Venice.
Venice, I enjoy going to Venice every time I have to go. Usually it's for an interview. I enjoy going there, but it's also, like some communities in Los Angeles, it's as cool as it is a pain in the ass to get to, because it's just not well connected to anything else, really, especially if you're near downtown like I am. So I wonder, though, it's an idea that I entertain occasionally about these places like Venice, that maybe the lack of an easy connection made it what it is. In some way, it was able to evolve into its own place, even though it's not even it's been incorporated into Los Angeles for 90 years. It's just part of the city. But do you credit the idea at all, and some people other than me bring it up, that the fact that it has been hard to get from place to place in Los Angeles has let places develop their own identities sort of more fruitfully?
That's an interesting hypothesis. And it seems intuitively to make some sense. But I mean, wasn't Venice weird and different even when it was well connected by streetcars and
if you consider those streetcars a good connection, I hear they were their own pain in the ass in a way.
Yeah, and I often, not always, but often, bike from Venice to UCLA, and the big blue buses, provide some, pretty good connections. I think LA is better connected than we usually think. Although I also do know that it's not perfect, right? I mean, it's that thing. If you have to make more than one transfer, it gets really difficult, right? And that last mile is really difficult.
Try getting to Torrance from here.
Yeah. And I mean, I was just thinking today, it's like, why don't, I was wondering, why don't they extend the Expo line to Venice?
Yeah.
That would be, I mean, instead of fighting over this, is it the purple line that's coming?
The purple line going, it's sort of through Beverly Hills.
And then we'll, eventually get to Westwood and eventually get to Santa Monica, I mean, unless the NIMBYs prevail as they seem to, so
less so these days.
Kind of like, so I don't know. I mean, it sounds like it sounds good, but I lived in Brazil for a year, and as a journalist, was writing about the environment. It's just back in 1989. The fate of the rainforest was a huge story. And
what city were you based in?
Well, so we traveled all over Brazil, in what they called a Toyota Bandeirantes, which is one of those old Land Cruisers, kind of shell with a diesel engine, which is really great. So drove from Rio de Janeiro out to the western edge of the country near the border with Peru. And, I interviewed, all kinds of people out, in the remote areas, of the Amazon. And so one thing that, has kind of stuck with me is, talking to like a leader from a small Indian village, and asked him, what is it that you want? So there's a huge debate going on about development in the Amazon, roads, deforestation. And he said the thing that we most want is an all-weather road. Is
practical.
Is a road that connects us to everybody else so that we can negotiate our own future on our terms, so that we're not dependent on, these merchants who come down the river with their boats, once every couple of weeks and, buy our products from us cheap and sell us goods dear. That made me question, this connection that we presume between being isolated and being able to hold on, to your difference or diversity, and made me question that and think much more about diversity in a cosmopolitan world, so that we can be well connected and we can hold on to those things that define our identity, that we care about, that we love. I think it's an ongoing question and an ongoing struggle.
What do you want to see in California? If you're thinking about the future in California when you're putting together these issues, what do you want to, broadly speaking, see happen here?
In California, wow! I get to imagine. Yeah. I get to imagine the future.
Don't be too specific, or else you could hear this 20 years from now and think, oh well, I was wrong about that. But broadly speaking,
no. It's a very, very inviting question. I mean, I tend to think, what do I want to see with the issues of Boom the journal that we produce quarterly over the next 4 years or so, and out of say 5 years, what are the kind of 20 really beautiful, substantive, provocative, inspirational things that we can contribute to the conversation about what do we want to see in California? What do we love about California? What do we worry about California? Where would we like to see things go? What are the essential things that we need to talk about, with each other? So I tend to think, in that kind of frame of what can we contribute to that conversation? So I'd love to see. A vibrant, beautiful, diverse, productive. It's the California that I imagine and that I think I see. I think I see all around us, and where this California and Los Angeles, in particular, as a great global city. Diverse city with people from dozens of countries speaking dozens of languages, is also in that vibrant conversation about the future of an urban planet. An urban, and as I said earlier, it's the urban as the metropolitan as being not isolated, but in relation to everything else. I mean, this story. In the next 30, 40 years, the urban built environment on the planet is going to double to accommodate the population growth, from 7 to 9 or 10 billion, which is going to double the urban population on the planet before population growth really levels off. So that urbanization is really the grand challenge that we face in the 21st century, and how that happens is going to fundamentally shape how people live with each other and how they live with nature, on the planet. And I would love to see, and we're thinking about this a lot here at UCLA, Los Angeles as a laboratory for those relationships, and as a laboratory in conversation with, Tokyo, Shanghai, Mexico City, Jakarta, other cities. Those are some of the cities that we're working with in an initiative here at UCLA called the Urban Humanities Initiative. But I'd like to see California and Los Angeles be in that kind of vibrant conversation with the rest of the world about the future.
You mentioned the reaction the rest of the world has when you say you're from California. I think of the mental images they have. I think they usually don't realize there's not that many people in California. There's under 40 million, right? 30, 38 something million. I think to myself, the state could use a lot of things. We could probably use twice as many people. What, do you think that's viable? Could the state handle that?
I think it probably could, and I'll probably get in trouble with some of my friends for saying that. It would mean, some pretty big changes, right? And I would hate to see that happen in some ways through the kind of development that we have seen historically.
Here? Yeah, no doubt.
In California.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, if part of that growth were through the kind of LA that we see in the movie Her, rather than the LA that we see in the movie Elysium.
Divide.
I think it would be, I think it would be pretty cool. I watched both of those movies again recently, and was kind of more disenchanted with Her than I was the first time, but I think it has more to do with the kind of anomie of the personal relationships and the work, rather than the city, which you're
on board with that vision of the city.
I mean, I do think, is a more dense, more high-rise city, connected with good, pleasant transportation.
The Hollywood Western Station comes out right to the beach.
Yeah,
that's one of the funnier moments in that movie. But it's one of the visions of the future you can sort of that can fuel you when you think about the future of California or Los Angeles.
Yes, and I think that, but I think again, it's, I'll get in trouble with some of my friends, for saying this, because we still live in John Muir's California. John Muir kind of set up this idea of California as cities being the places where people live and work, and then the productive landscape of, ranches and farms and mines and the wilderness cathedrals of nature, I say that we still live in that because I think people still have this mental image of that's California, but it's changing, and we're seeing, the idea that nature runs through all of that, from the city through the suburbs and the countryside to wilderness, and culture does too. The wilderness itself is something that we've made through laws and management and practices and ideas, and I think that old California, the idea that we could double the population of California, which would really come mostly from a doubling of urban population, is very scary and is very threatening to the rest of that landscape because of those oppositions. But I think that it's possible for a new, more diverse, younger California, like my students, to see that nature and culture runs through all of that, and there are ways that we can cultivate and sustain that natural and cultural diversity with the kind of vibrancy of urban social, connected, life.
I've been speaking here at UCLA in Los Angeles, California, with Jon Christensen. He's the editor of the newly rebooted, newly excitingly and very fascinatingly rebooted Boom, a Journal of California from the University of California Press. Jon, thanks so much.
Oh, it was a great pleasure. Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.